So this really was a way of starving people out of their right to be in a trade union. And you know, families were starving. They were trying to send their children over to England so that they could at least be looked after and at least eat. And then they started to arrest the leaders of this strike movement in Dublin. Now, one of the leaders of this movement in Dublin came over to England for a big kind of solidarity tour, where they had a massive meeting in the Albert Hall. And one of the speakers, the most popular speaker in the Albert Hall that day, was Sylvia Pankhurst. She was wanted by the police at this point, so it was a fantastic surprise to everybody when she pops up on the platform in the Albert Hall in front of thousands of people. And she gave a speech in which she said, when she identified the common cause of people fighting for better conditions and women fighting for the vote. Now, this was all far too much for her older sister, Christabel Pankhurst, who really opposed the direction that Sylvia Pankhurst was taking things in. And Sylvia was summoned to see her older sister and was ordered to leave the Women's Social and Political Union, ordered to leave the main militant women's suffrage organisation. Now, according to Sylvia Pankhurst's autobiography, and some of the records as well that were kept by the women, this really related to the question of whether working class women could be part of the suffragette movement or should be excluded. And according to Sylvia Pankhurst, this is what her older sister told her. A working women's movement was of no value. Working women were the weakest portion of the sex. How could it be otherwise? Their lives were too hard, their education too meagre to equip them for the contest. Surely it is a mistake to use the weakest for the struggle. We want picked women, the very strongest and most intelligent. So, apart from being quite insulting, that tells us quite a lot about what this division was about. Now, this happened in 1914. So, Sylvia Pankhurst's response to this was to set up her own organisation that she'd already been kind of organising a few years before. She went to the poorest part of London, the East End, and she began to organise amongst women there, amongst these working class women who'd been written off by people like Christabel Pankhurst. And so she engaged with lots of these women, again in these same sort of factories who were going on strike. She did an amazing things in a few number of months. She set up a junior suffragettes club for suffragettes between the ages of 14 and 18. And one of those junior suffragettes was a young woman called Rose Pengelly. She was 15 years old. She worked in an asbestos factory. And because she was a young woman, she was really treated amongst the worst of all the workers there. The boss also saw her as his sort of personal servant. And she led all of her workmates out on strike. She joined the junior suffragettes and then decided they were going to have to do something about it. So these were the kinds of women they were getting involved. They produced their own newspaper, the Woman's Dreadnought, where they wrote about what their lives were like, wrote about what they wanted changed. And they also didn't forget about women who were working in the homes. So what they would do is they would go what they called canvassing. Obviously, they didn't have a vote, but they did go canvassing. And they would pick a street, they would go door to door, they'd knock on every door, they'd ask those women what they thought about the vote, they'd argue with them, and they'd report back what those women had said in their newspapers. There was a real engagement with the local community. And that was also part of what was really distinctive about Sylvia Pankhurst's campaign. She got the whole community involved in defending the suffragettes. So when the local council refused to let the suffragettes use any more halls in the area, or sent the police in when they were holding a meeting, Sylvia Pankhurst's group would be defended by local dockers and local transport workers, as well as the women who were involved in the suffragette movement. So it was something that everybody kind of felt that they could be a part of. And really this was Sylvia Pankhurst making a campaign again about the issues, about the concerns that have got women involved in the first place. And one of the clearest examples of this took place in June 1914. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, Herbert Asquith, was by this stage refusing to receive any deputations of women at all, particularly suffragettes. And this was because he saw them really by this point as a bunch of terrorists that he was not going to engage with. And that's precisely how he saw these women in East London as well. So Sylvia Pankhurst, she'd been released from prison, and she decided to continue her hunger strike. Sylvia Pankhurst didn't just go on hunger strike in prison, it's worth saying. She went on thirst strike, and she even went on rest strike, so she wouldn't sleep. So she would force them to release her earlier. And she said she wasn't going to stop doing that just because she'd been released. So she demanded to be taken to the House of Commons, and she lay on the steps. She was very weak, she couldn't even really sit up. And she lay on the steps of the House of Commons, and she said, until the Prime Minister receives, or agrees to receive, a deputation of working women, I will continue to do this. So he backed down quite quickly. And a group of 6 women were chosen from East London to go and see the Prime Minister. They were chosen in big democratic meetings, so they picked who their representative was going to be. And these really were very ordinary women, but also very extraordinary women, who were obviously at the heart of their own communities, did do very dangerous kinds of work. They did things like working in cigarette factories, some of them worked in the home, things like that. And they went along to go and see the Prime Minister and put their case about why they wanted the vote. And I just want to read from the statements that 2 women gave to the Prime Minister. The first one is from a woman called Mrs. Ford. And she had worked in factories all of her life since she was very, very young. And it's quite, I would say, first of all, before I read it, it's quite a sad thing that she says. So just to sort of warn you of that. But I think it's important because it tells you why these women wanted the vote, what they thought this campaign was really about. So this is what Mrs. Ford said. She said, I would like to give you an instance of what happened to me and the sort of thing that happens to most women when they are left with young children. They know they are not earning enough to keep those young children, and therefore are afraid to lose their work. In one place I was at, the manager was very anxious to kiss me, and I should have had to submit to that to keep my work. It was either a case of losing my own self-respect or losing my children's food. In the same place where I work, there was a young girlfriend of mine who worked with me, and she was perhaps somewhat weak-willed, and the inevitable result happened. She had to go to the workhouse to have a baby. When she came out, she had no mother and no home to go to. I took her with me, and she shared my bed and my room when there were 5 of us. Money was very short, and sooner than take the food, as she felt she was doing, out of my children's mouths, she felt there was not enough for us. She went away, and I did not see her until 3 days afterwards, when she was drawn out of the River Lee with her child. I think if women had something to do with making the laws, that is one of the first things they would alter. So that's what Mrs. Ford talked about. Other women talked about the fact that as poorer women, their husbands died younger than richer women. They talked about the poor housing that they lived in. They talked about the extortionate cost of rent. They talked about sexual harassment like Mrs. Ford did. They talked about how their streets weren't safe for their children to play in. And then we come to Mrs. Savoy. Now, Mrs. Savoy was a brush maker. She'd been a brush maker since the age of 10. But she didn't go as Mrs. Savoy that day. She went as Mrs. Hughes, because her husband didn't want his name in the papers. So she went under a false name to go and see the Prime Minister. And she brought along her brushes, presumably to acquaint the Prime Minister with the concept of hard work. And when she got there, she slammed these brushes down in front of him. And at this point, obviously bearing in mind what the suffragette movement was like by 1914, the Prime Minister and his aides thought this was a bomb. So they kind of went mad for a while, and then once they calmed down and realised it was a brush, Mrs. Savoy addressed the Prime Minister of Great Britain, this woman who'd been at work since 10 years old, and she was now a middle-aged woman. And she said this to the Prime Minister of Great Britain: I do not like having to work 14 hours a day without having a voice on it. And I think when a woman works 14 hours a day, she has a right to a vote, as my husband has. And he does not hardly work at all. Which apart from being a glorious bit of revenge on Mr. Savoy, really I think tells you something about these women from East London, which is that they thought, instead of the way that the vote had always been granted in this country, which was to start with the richest people first and have a property qualification, and then when the powers that be deemed the next group of people were respectable and responsible enough to handle a vote, it could maybe trickle down a little bit further. These women were arguing something totally radical, which was that the people that did all the work in society ought to be given political representation precisely because they did all of the work in society. Now this deputation was seen as a real turning point in the campaign. We don't know what would have happened. The First World War intervened. But the fact that the Prime Minister had seen this deputation, the fact that at the end of the deputation he said if there's going to be votes for women, it has to be democratic and far-reaching. And really what the women thought he meant by that was that he was talking about giving women the vote as they campaigned for, on the same terms as men, which obviously women didn't get straight after the First World War. So really they might have won something much more radical had the First World War not intervened. So this was a remarkable achievement. And I think when we listen to the voices of those women and what they were saying, I think it tells us something else that's very, very important. I think far too often, really, we're told that history is about great people, great individuals, and usually those happen to be sort of kings or occasionally politicians, that this is where all the change in society happens, that really it's a history of the powerful people in society. I think what this deputation proves, what the story of Sylvia Pankhurst and the suffragettes in East London, as well as suffragettes all up and down the country, shows, is that history isn't made by those people. History is made by people that are constantly written off all of their lives, people that work in horrible conditions, people that sacrifice everything, people that campaign and know that their names won't be remembered. It's made by ordinary people like you and me. It's made by people who work in cigarette factories, who made brushes since the age of 10. And I think that's a very, very important message to remember. So, thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, that was excellent. Right then, we're just going to have our second break. Obviously, the waitress will kind of get to everybody as soon as they can. When the waitresses bring out the cake, we're not expecting any riots, and I'm not going to come round force-feeding you, so don't worry. Obviously, the hunger strike didn't do very good for me, did it?